Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of diplomacy between the wars. And in this final lecture on the diplomacy of the 1920s, we'll take a big picture look at diplomacy of that era and think about how did diplomacy of this period work out in the long run. Historians have disagreed about the nature of diplomacy in the 1920s. Was the American diplomatic strategy in the years after World War I hopelessly naive and weak, as some scholars have claimed? Or was it perhaps more effective than it might seem in hindsight? With the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and say it was ineffective in the long run, for sure. We all know World War II is coming a little more than a decade later. But the emphasis on peace in the 1920s didn't come at the total expense of military preparedness. Many in the State Department and the military branches felt we had strayed too far into the realm of the peace advocates, and they fought for continued preparedness. The Republican administrations of the 20s emphasized preparedness along similar lines to what the United States had endorsed for decades. These included a strong navy and battle fleet, a small regular army, primarily training and planning for potential wars or conflict, and a strong industrial economy on the home front, capable of conversion to war production if needed. And it should be noted that even in the worst times of the Great Depression, American military expenditures were always more than double that of pre-World War I levels. The period also marked a time of significant improvements to the American military. Improvements in training methods and organizational systems. The expansion of international intelligence efforts. The beginnings of a modern tank force. Recognition of the Air Service in 1920, and the Air Force Act of 1926, which called for a 5-year program of expansion of the Air Corps. And by 1933, the Air Corps had more than 1,500 planes. Improvements in and growing numbers of submarines. Developments in naval aviation, including development of the early aircraft carriers. And by the late 1920s, modernization and technological improvement of various weapon systems, such as the semi-automatic rifle, and improvements in ships and airplanes. We also should note that in this period, there was no clear and evident threat developing in the European sphere. All the European nations were recovering from World War I, and popular revulsion and suspicion of war meant that those nations were slow to rebuild their militaries. Great Britain, for instance, in 1919 declared the 10-year rule that actually lasted until 1932, mandating that it would not become involved in a major war. During that period, military expenditures were minimal, and Britain maintained only a very small peacetime military force. It's also worth noting that the technology of the day limited the threat principally of air attack. Throughout the 1920s, the United States remained essentially unthreatened at all by any sort of air attack. As late as 1935, the longest range bomber in the world had a range of only 500 miles. That is, it could fly for 1,000 miles, 500 miles out and 500 miles back. Thus, no airplane in the world was capable of launching an air attack directly against the United States. And in fact, it was the United States that had the most technologically advanced air force by the mid-1930s. America's sense of security was also enhanced by the booming economy. And again, if they were wrong about that, we have to bear in mind that it's with the benefit of hindsight that we realize now how fragile the economy was. In the wake of World War I, much of America's foreign policy was driven by economic concerns. Access to oil reserves in the Middle East, control of oil and other resources in Latin America, and maintaining the so-called open door in China, meaning equal access for the United States and other colonial powers. As the 1920s went on, and the booming economy of the Roaring Twenties seemed invulnerable to international ripples, even waging robust diplomatic efforts directed at these economic matters seemed unnecessary. The United States, in short, could maintain its economic viability on its own. Or so it seemed. As a final thought, we must remember that no one knew at that time that the Great Depression was coming. The economic comfort of the 20s and the primacy of America's position in the global economy seemed secure. The arrangements and peace agreements of the 20s may seem naive in hindsight, but they hinged on the dependence of other nations on American economic support. If that prosperity had continued, the policies of the 20s that seem so ineffectual now might actually have continued to be effective. As it turns out, of course, the Great Depression did set in, and the American economy, like the rest of the world, wavered and then collapsed. Other nations could no longer rely on American assistance, and the United States itself found that relying solely on the domestic economy was insufficient. In short, the policies of the 1920s were put to the test in the 1930s, and they failed.